Welcome, beloved listeners, to our little wireless program. I've been trying to work out when the Sydney Peace Prize actually started. I think it was in 1998. And many of the winners passed almost without comment. They were just so wonderfully respectable. Who could complain about Desmond Tutu or Sir William Dean or Mary Robinson? But once Hanan Ashrawi won in 2003, the critics of the prize started to get their knickers in a twist. Much the same response to Arundhati Roy, to Hans Blix, who got it in 2007, John Pilger, my old friend. God, conniptions. And now it's gone to Noam Chomsky, and the right-wing commentariat are enraged. I don't think that worries Noam Chomsky too much, does it, Noam?
No, not particularly. Unless there's something substantive, I pay attention. Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that you're almost as immune to accolades as you are to criticism. You seem to brush it all off. I mean, you're frequently described as the most important intellectual alive. You don't blush when that's said, or...
Well, when people quote that, they never quote the next sentence.
Fill me in.
The next sentence, it was in the New York Times. The next sentence was something like, how can he write such terrible things about American foreign policy?
Anyway,
that somehow never gets quoted in the press.
Well, it's on the record now.
Yeah, okay.
No, this is about our 13th or 14th chat, and it's just wonderful to have you here, and let me add to this mountain of congratulations on the one hand, as opposed to the attacks on the other. It's you must have a groaning mantelpiece of...
Sorry?
You must have a mantelpiece groaning with prizes.
There's a pile somewhere, not a mantelpiece.
Look, in all the times I've talked to you, I've never had a chance to ask you a little bit about your extraordinary youth. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about William and Elsie.
About?
Your father and mother, William and Elsie.
My father was... they were both first-generation immigrants. My father came when he was about 17. He came in 1913 from the Ukraine. He came essentially to escape the Tsar's draft, which was almost a death sentence for Jewish boys. He lived in a village which was later wiped out by the Nazis. Nothing left. He, when he came to the United States, didn't know any English. He worked in a sweatshop in Baltimore, managed to learn the language, got some education, finally went to Johns Hopkins, got a degree, ended up a pretty important Hebrew scholar, did a lot of work on medieval Hebrew grammar. In fact, when I was a child, I was reading the draft of his dissertation on David Kimche, a 13th century medieval grammarian. And he went on to be an educator, kind of a Deweyite educator, and taught in Hebrew College and then the graduate University of Jewish Studies in Philadelphia, Dropsy College. It's my father. My mother was also an immigrant. She came when she was a baby, about a year old, and she came from what's now Belarus. Family was in New York. Also, both families are super Orthodox. I mean, I remember my mother telling me that when she was with her friends in the streets of New York, say a young teenager, if she saw her father coming towards them, they would cross the street because she didn't want to be embarrassed in front of her friends by having her father pass by and act as if he didn't recognize her, mere girl. She was very smart. Independent, but she couldn't go to college. That's only for boys. So her younger brother was allowed to go to college, but she could only go to normal school. She became a teacher, an educator, also Hebrew educator, wrote books. Actually, the two of us even wrote a play together once in Hebrew, but she became a pretty influential educator in the Hebrew, I wouldn't say, ghetto isn't exactly the right word, but there was, they lived in Philadelphia where I grew up, there was a segment of the Jewish community, mostly first-generation immigrants, who were deeply engaged in revival of Hebrew, revival of modernization of Jewish culture. They wanted to split from the diaspora tradition of Eastern Europe.
And split from Yiddish?
Yeah, both my parents, their native language was Yiddish, but they wouldn't let us hear a word. So all I learned of Yiddish was what everybody learns from Woody Allen or the secret language of your parents.
You drop the odd Yiddish word into your public performances, though, don't you?
Occasionally.
Yeah. So, who influenced you the most politically, mum or dad?
Politically, really neither. I mean, this is the 30s, so they were fairly conventional New Deal Democrats. I mean, I can remember listening to Roosevelt's fireside chats and Friday evening, there was a kind of a mood of calm settling over the family. Everything's going to be okay. But the influences on me politically, to the extent they came from the family, came from a different part of the family. My mother's relatives were all in New York. New York's a short train ride from Philadelphia. By the time I got old enough to travel myself, about 11 or 12, I'd take the train to New York all the time, stay with a couple of my relatives, and they were working class mostly, most of them unemployed at the time, and there was a very lively working class culture in the 1930s. It's sort of forgotten, but like one uncle who was maybe the biggest influence on my life at that age, actually never went past 4th grade, and others had some education, but not much.
Your uncle was a Trotskyite, wasn't he?
He had been through every sect that there was and had rejected them all. So he wasn't he was an ex-Trotskyite, but an ex-everything else as well.
You were never seduced by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, were you?
By the time I was about 12 years old, I was not only anti-Stalinist, but anti-Leninist from the left. And I was being led towards the anarchist movements and towards the left Marxists. I mean, there was a major component of the Marx tradition which was very critical of Bolshevism from the left. There was another one from the right, the Mensheviks, but there was an important one on the left. People like Anton Pannekoek was one of the leading intellectuals of the social democracy, but a left critic of Bolshevism and others. And those are the people I read, and they were not too far from components of the anarchist movement. They were sort of close to the anarcho-syndicalists, who I was also interested in. I became very much interested in the Spanish Revolution right around around 1940, around that time.
Well, that was one of the impulse to write pretty much your first column or your first article when you were 10.
I don't know if it was the first one, but it was, an early one. I was the editor of the 4th grade newspaper, probably the only reader, except maybe for my mother, I don't know. But I did write an article, which I sort of half remember, right after the fall of Barcelona, so that would have been about February 1939. It wasn't specifically about the Spanish Civil War. It was about the spread of fascism in Europe, which seemed, as a child, it seemed very frightening and ominous. I mean, I listened to Hitler's speeches on the radio. I didn't understand anything, but you could pick up the mood and the threat and sort of knew some of the things that were happening. And the article was about the fall of Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and now Spain. At the time, it looked as if fascism was unstoppable. It was going to spread over the world. It was frightening in itself, but it also had it tied in with personal experiences, which incidentally my parents never even knew about. Those days, you didn't talk to your parents about personal things. It's not, at least boys didn't. It's not done. But we lived in a neighborhood where we were the only Jewish family, and the neighborhood was pretty pro-fascist. Partly it was Irish Catholic, and they just hated the British, and partly it was German. They were pro-Nazi. But as a boy in the streets, you get to run into these things. And I grew up with just a visceral fear of Catholics. I knew when the kids came out of the Catholic school down the street, they were going to be raving anti-Semites. And maybe later in the afternoon, they'd calm down. They could play ball or something. But it's just part of experience was fear of violently anti-Semitic, mostly Catholic kids coming from this Jesuit school.
Well, with this momentum, with this background, why didn't you study politics when you went to university? Why did you suddenly opt for linguistics?
I didn't study politics because I really didn't believe in what was being taught. I thought I had better insight from other sources. And I, in retrospect, think that was probably a wise decision. Actually, I got into linguistics through political contacts. It's just a personal story. I don't know if it's of any general interest.
Well, I'd love to hear it.
I went to a Deweyite experimental school. As I said, my father was very much interested in Dewey's educational theories and practiced them. It was run by Temple University Education Department, which happened to be a progressive education department. It was a terrific school. I was there from infancy, really, about 18 months old, since my parents worked until high school, so until 12. And it was a very exciting experience. There was you weren't graded. There were no ranking. Actually, I didn't know I was a good student until I got into high school. I mean, I knew I had skipped a grade, but okay, this just meant I was the smallest kid in the class. Nobody paid any attention to it. It did, the teachers kind of inspired creative work, often cooperative. You worked with other people or you just pursued your own interests. There was a curriculum, you followed it. And I can remember the school very well. Then I got into the academic high school. There's one academic high school in the city, actually two, one for boys, one for girls. My future wife went to the girls one. And it was kind of like a black hole. I don't remember a thing. Everything was graded. You had to pass exams, everything was ranked. It was extremely boring. I was looking forward to going to college. The local college, of course, there's no thought of going anywhere else. You live at home, you work, you go to college. But and I looked, I was 16 when I got into college, and the catalog looked very exciting. I was going to take courses in, Greek, this, that, all kind of exciting stuff. When I started to take the courses, I discovered it's high school. It's just boring, routine. And I was ready to drop out after about a year. I didn't see any point going on. And I happened to run into, through political contact, through what's now would be called anti-Zionist, then it was Zionist, left Zionist, anti-state, radical activism. I ran into a professor at the...
This is Zelig Harris.
Zelig Harris,
yeah.
Who was very much involved in these things. In fact, was at the center of many of these movements and had a big influence on a lot of young Jewish intellectuals at the period. He didn't write much, so nobody knows about it, but was very influential and kind of a charismatic person. I got to know him, and he... In retrospect, I think he was trying to convince me to get back into college. He didn't say anything, but he just suggested that I start taking some of his graduate courses. So I took them. And then
Isn't life serendipitous?
Strange.
Absolutely arbitrary in a way, isn't it?
Well, the whole thing for me is totally so. I don't even have professional qualifications, which is why I'm teaching at MIT. They didn't care. But I had no professional qualifications in any field. Through Harris's influence, I started taking graduate. He directed me to faculty members at the university who were pretty exciting people, but in different fields. One was in mathematics, another in philosophy, and I ended up with a strange hodgepodge of...
Well, you did pretty well because you finished up as institutional professor and professor emeritus of linguistic and philosophy at MIT, which isn't too bad for a sort of an autodidact.
It was serendipitous, you used to say. It's mostly accidental. When I got out of... I did go for 4 years of at Harvard graduate work, Society of Fellows, kind of a graduate sub-institution at Harvard for select students, and that was very free also. It was kind of like elementary school again. But when I was finished with that, I had no profession. and I had no particular job prospects. And I had friends at MIT, and they just suggested that I come to I get a job in the electronics lab. I mean, I can't tell a radio from a tape recorder to this day. If something goes wrong with my computer, I've checked with my grandchildren. But so I had an interview. The head of our research lab of electronics, a person who became pretty well known, Jerry Wiesner, became Kennedy's science advisor shortly after. And we had an interview. He was interested. I talked to him about what I was interested in. He thought it was interesting. He suggested that I work in a project that they had there on machine translation. And I told him I thought it was a silly project. I wasn't going to work on it. The way to solve it was just brute force. There was nothing else he could do, which turned out to be correct years later. But he thought that was a pretty good answer. So he said, okay, why don't you just work on what you're interested in? And it kind of went on from there. But it was luck, Otherwise, I would never have ended up in the academic world.
It's interesting that even if you had never made a public utterance on matters political, that you were going to be a trailblazer, because I vividly recall your great contribution, your great theoretical contribution to the notion of language, that it is innate and not learnt. And you argued, discovered, the role of hormones in the emergence of human language, in much the same way as hormones play such a part in the emergence of puberty.
In a sense, that's correct. I mean, there was a kind of a general atmosphere in Cambridge, Mass, which it was all over the place, but in Cambridge it was kind of the peak. In philosophy, social sciences, psychology, linguistics, practically all fields, it was called behavioral science. There was a belief, there was an interesting period that in American life altogether was an interesting period. It's worth remembering that before the Second World War, the United States was far and away the richest country in the world, but it really wasn't a major player in world affairs. Britain was the dominant power, and intellectually it was a kind of a backwater. If you wanted to study physics or philosophy or math, you went to Germany or England. If you wanted to be a writer, you went to Paris. The United States was like central Iowa. You wanted to get out if you wanted to do anything. So much so that after the Second World War, when I was teaching at MIT, we were still teaching French and German to the graduate students because as a holdover from the pre-war period, they had to know them because that's where the work was. After the Second World War changed all that dramatically. Power shifted to the United States. It became the major technological center, intellectual center. A lot of European emigres came. They fled fascism. Europe was devastated. So there was a kind of a sort of a Rome-Greece attitude towards Europe. It's there. It's
so
faded,
your personal timing was perfect, wasn't it?
Pardon?
Your personal timing was perfect.
Luck had it. But it was more than that. I mean, there was a sense in the United States in the 50s, if you read back the literature then, that we can discard all of that old-fashioned stuff. That was all old European stuff. We're going to do it the right way. We're Americans. We'll do everything from scratch. And it had an objective basis. The United States at that time was, by far it had literally half the world's wealth and incredible security. And it was in a position to dominate the world, and planners knew it. There were careful plans laid for running the world. But in the intellectual spheres, and it was kind of at its peak in places like Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, and so on, there was a sense that we can start everything all over. And there were a lot of new discoveries. The early 1950s, there was discovery of DNA. Okay, we've somehow, in the 1930s, there was, and it included a major American scientist, Linus Pauling. There was became possible to unify chemistry and physics with the new quantum theory. And that was a step forward. And during the war, a lot of technological development. Mm-hmm. After the war came, in the late 40s, information theory, which looked like could be a unifying concept for the human sciences. And Then came radical behaviorism, Skinner's work, late 40s, that looked like kind of the answer to human behavior. A couple of years later came Crick and Watson, discovery of DNA. It looked as if somehow biology was going to be integrated into chemistry, which already somehow had a link to physics. And the concept of unified science, we can unify all of science and march on, was very dominant.
It's still just beyond our reach, isn't it?
By now,
been seen forever.
There's a lot more modesty now,
Yeah.
and properly. In the human sciences, including linguistics, there was a sense that everything was basically solved, with just kind of a few touches here and there, but the basic ideas are understood. The most influential philosopher of the period, it happened to be at Harvard, W.V. Quine, one of the very influential philosopher. His view was that, as he put it, language is just essentially an arbitrary collection of conditioned responses. It's a fabric of sentences connected to one another and to stimuli by conditioned response and Skinnerian lines. And that was virtually dogma. That, together with information theory, the computers were just coming along. It looked as if it would be possible to automate analytic techniques. That's where the machine translation interest came from. There were a couple of us, actually 3 grad students who didn't believe a word of it at Harvard, and early 50s, and we tried to work out our own views. One of them died some years ago. He was the founder of modern biology of language. Another is my office mate still after 60 years at MIT. He's retired also. But we thought, first of all, that with regard to language, that the core problems were just being ignored and not even studied. I mean, the most elementary property of language, when you think about it, and it was kind of understood in the 17th and 18th century, is that the core is a capacity which all humans share and no other organism has to act creatively with language, to produce an unbounded number of expressions which have very specific meaning and very specific sound, not determined by stimuli, either external or internal, appropriate to situations, not caused by them, intelligible to others who recognize that they could have expressed the same thought the same way that never occurred to them before, and it can go on without bounds. It's a kind of an elementary aspect of human nature, and a very distinctive one. If you go back to, say, Descartes, that was kind of the core of Cartesian philosophy, and it spread and found its way into all sorts of directions, like classical liberalism, much Enlightenment thought. A lot of it's been forgotten since, but it was quite real. Then it was forgotten in the 19th century. Then the 20th century became turned into what I just described, kind of behavioral science, analysis of data, and so on. But it was missing all of these points.
And then the 3 of you come along, and?
Well, the 3 of us, just a couple of other friends, but it was mainly the 3 of us, thought, first of all, that this ought to be the core problem for the study of language. And the other thing we thought was that language should not be divorced from biology, that the capacity for language is a biological capacity, much like, say, the visual system or the immune system and so on, just some subsystem of the cognitive faculties, which can be studied on its own, but also integrated with others. That later came to be called biolinguistics. And pursuing those 2 directions, a new approach to language, and cognitive science sort of began to develop in interaction with this around the same time. It's still a very conflicted. It's not that everyone accepts it by any means.
I'm aware of that. Yeah. You are under constant attack in that area of your life, as you are politically.
It's a contested area, but I think I don't really think shouldn't be much controversy about it. But out of that came, and then MIT just became the center of it. We were all at MIT, and one of us, Eric Lenneberg went off to medical school and worked on biology of language. And Morris Halley is, as I said, still my office mate after all these years. And we developed a department, and students came and so on and so forth, spread all over the world.
And you were able to demonstrate quite convincingly that the capacity to learn language was at its greatest when the human being is pretty young.
It was kind of known intuitively, but as the topic became studied much more intensively, actually, some of the best work's done by a couple of scientists who are right here now, Stephen Crane and Ross Thornton. By now there's intensive study of acquisition of language, and like other biological capacities, it appears to have what's called a critical period. It functions almost reflexively at a certain stage of life. Later stages, it
gets damn sight harder, doesn't it?
It has to be done differently. Actually, there are individual differences, but it's generally true.
I'd like you to rest your weary voice for a minute while I identify the program. Late Night Live on ABC Radio National, Radio Australia and the web. And my very, very voice-weary guest, because boy have they been putting him through the media hoops, is of course Noam Chomsky. Okay.